Hey class, Mr. Coster here. Alright, welcome to Chapter 5, Section 3. In Section 2, we began to see how the British were oppressing the colonists and how the colonists were getting really angered by these new policies. Well, those new policies are only going to continue here in Section 3. This section is entitled The Breech Widens, meaning the relationship spreads further and further apart, the gap widens. And one of the first things to do that were called the Townshend Acts. Townshend is named after a political leader in Great Britain who came up with this law, passed in 1767. Well, the Townshend Acts were a collection of taxes. A tax on tea, a tax on glass, a tax on paper, a tax on lead, and a tax on even products like paint. The colonists hated it. So there was a real cry from people like Samuel Adams, of course, to denounce the tax and call for the colonists to boycott the good. To boycott something means to not buy it, to refuse to buy it, instead to go without that product in order to keep Britain from getting the taxes on that item. So this is just one of the many events going on. But then occasionally we had some violent events, and one of the more famous events was called the Boston Massacre. As you know, there's great distrust growing between the colonists and the British. The British soldiers have troops living amongst the people in all of the colonies, and in Boston especially. Well, on the night of March 5th, 1770, a bunch of Bostonians began to boo and hiss and throw rotten eggs and snowballs at the troops as they marched down the street. Well, of course, the British began to kind of respond back, and taunting went back and forth between the groups, some men and some boys taunting the soldiers, and all of a sudden a shot gets fired by one of the British. Next thing you know, it is chaos, and chaos totally ensues, and by the end of it, 5 colonists are dead. 6 others are injured, and this becomes known as the Boston Massacre. It's unknown who gave the order to fire, as Captain Preston of the British said, "I never ordered him to fire." I'm not sure where the order came from. And this event became a huge deal as people from around the colonies, Georgia, South Carolina, up to Boston, heard about the event and couldn't believe that this is how the British were treating people up north, causing all kinds of frustration. I do want to point out the pictures on the screen here. Notice the 3 drawings, all different renditions of what took place. We'll talk in class about which ones of those are maybe the most accurate. The picture on the right is we call it today the old State House. You see it in the drawings. That's the State House today. We'll be going to it on our trip. And so it's right in front of that building where this took place a long time ago. Things continue to and to be difficult. And one way that the colonists challenged and protested these taxes was called the Committees of Correspondence, also created by Samuel Adams. And these committees were organized to protest British taxes, of course, and oppressive actions. And so every colony, many towns in each colony, had a different committee. And they would alert other areas, alert colonists of the threats to their civil liberties by the British. It was a great way to kind of unify the colonies. And of course, the big overarching complaint continues to be no taxation without representation. These committees of correspondence, like the Sons of Liberty, were an organization created to protest the taxes and kind of to unify the colonists and to help them all see how the British were taking advantage of their rights. One of the most unpopular taxes was a new tax on tea called the Tea Act of 1773. And this tax, of course, placed on tea, and part of the arrangement was that the colonists had to purchase their tea from the East India Tea Company. East India is a property of Great Britain, and so Great Britain wanted to kind of help out that colony of theirs and mandated the colonists buy their tea from them. It wasn't a horrible price, but the colonists hated being told where they had to buy tea from. And so the committees of correspondence organized a bit of a protest. And this protest became the Boston Tea Party. Instead of paying for tea from the East India Company and supporting them, instead of paying a tax on it, they decided instead to dress up as Indians, board the ships that carried the tea, and toss the tea overboard into the Boston Harbor, creating a lot of iced tea. And they threw it all and destroyed the tea. The British government was furious. The king was outraged that these colonists would destroy this kind of tea. Let me tell you how much tea this was. We're looking at about $2 million worth of tea in today's currency. No small amount. British people enjoy drinking tea, and of course the colonists were British. So they liked their tea, and they ruined a bunch of it right here, all as a protest against British and their rules and policies against them. So the king's going to Intolerable Acts, and the Intolerable Acts are brutal. The purpose of the Intolerable Acts was to punish the colonists, not just to get some money, not just to help pay for troops, but it is there to punish the colonists, and colonists are furious. A couple key parts to the Intolerable Acts. First was, the British closed the port of Boston. They said, Boston, you may no longer ship anything in or out of Boston Harbor. Well, that's how the Bostonians made money. They're a shipping community. They're a trading community. And they weren't going to be able to ship things again until the debt was paid back to the East India Company for the tea they destroyed. And the second main component of the Intolerable Act was a stronger quartering act. This was passed, which allowed the British soldiers to take whatever supplies or buildings needed to house British troops. They could go in and live wherever they wanted to, any building, any home, anything. It was awful. And then, a third component that's really important as well is that the people of Massachusetts began to lose their rights, their political rights. They could no longer conduct town meetings. They could no longer elect representatives or name judges or even have juries. Their rights were totally being violated as the king tried to punish them for their, of course, horrible actions in the Boston Tea Party. So, as you can see from the last two sections, tension is increasing between the British and the colonists. We are on the verge of something very explosive.